Hello everyone and welcome. So, Veist, one of the most impractical perks to test and evaluate. After all, it's totally random and does more than one thing. It lasts for 7 seconds, fully reloads the magazine from reserves upon proccing, and also decreases charge time for the duration that it's active. In this video, we'll break down multiple aspects of its functions and I'll give some simulated DPS numbers. So first up, RNG. Let's quickly discuss the probability of Veist proccing. Now, there are a few ways to discuss the probability of something happening, and you could make a whole video just talking about that and the maths behind it. Specifically here, I'm quite literally just going to give a percentage value of likelihood based off of the number of times I fired Read Regret, and out of those, how many times Veist procced. This does not include rounds where the perk was already active, but I will touch on that later in the video. So after going back through most of the footage recorded for this video, I fired Read Regret at Cali 304 times when Veist was not active. Out of those rounds, it procced 30 times. This means, and please do bear in mind the sample size is very small here, that the probability for me was roughly 0.0987, or a 9.87% chance. Once I hit around 250 rounds, I noticed that value had already started to settle around 10%, so I continued until passing 300 rounds, and it still remained around that 10% figure, give or take 0.5%. Now, this does not mean that Veist is guaranteed to proc once for every 10 rounds fired, for example. I had a couple of clips where I was able to fire 15 or more times at Cali and it didn't proc at all. This is basically implying that every time you fire a round and damage a target, there's a 10% chance the perk will proc, regardless of the outcome from the previous round, unless it did proc. Again, this is a very rough figure since the sample size is incredibly small, but I think it's a fair comparison that every time you damage a target with Read Regret and Veist selected, there's a 10% chance it will activate. So what does this do for charge time? For this, I tested liquid coils, enhanced battery, and accelerated coils. A quick note here that for accelerated coils, I had a charge time masterwork at rank 4. Unfortunately, this is the only one I have with accelerated coils, triple tap, and Veist. Liquid and enhanced didn't have a charge time masterwork, so no difference there. As well as charge time, I'm also going to give numbers for the time between rounds fired. This is something that I had to do for the simulated DPS numbers, and it also gives a strong indication that Veist only reduces charge time and doesn't have any unexpected effects on the animation of the weapon after it's fired. For example, on screen now is a table showing the raw data for 16 rounds from each of the 3 coil or battery perks, with and without Veist. I've gone to 3 decimal places, but I record at 60 FPS and measure time by frame, so that third decimal point isn't particularly accurate. Now, there is a variation in the numbers, but you may notice it's always by around 16 or 17 milliseconds, which is 1 frame at 60 frames per second, meaning there is a certain amount of inconsistency when testing timings this way. I would have preferred to use macros, but that method will be really awkward and time consuming to use with Veist. Cycling through some quick clips now for accelerated, enhanced, and liquid, with and without Veist. The difference may look small on paper, but it's noticeable in game after a couple of rounds have been fired. Applying some context and analysis to the previous table of raw data, and we have this. The difference in time and percentage change, as I've said, is just down to inconsistencies when testing using frames. But I think it's a fair assumption to make that Veist will reduce charge time by 14 to 15%, while the bottom table shows the difference between each of the coil and battery perks with and without Veist. Enhance has been used as a base for comparison. What I find very interesting, and I've mentioned this in a previous video, is that it doesn't reduce damage while decreasing charge time, which is quite a big deal. So next point, what happens if triple tap and Veist proc at the same time? Well, this could go one of 2 ways. Firstly, if Veist was to proc first, then it's likely the round returned by triple tap would be wasted, which is what happens with 4 times the Charm and Clown cartridge and Cataclysmic, for example, as it can increase mag size beyond capacity. But if triple tap was to proc first, then the round would be returned to the mag and 1 less taken from reserves than normal when Veist auto reloads. 2 clips will be coming onto screen in a moment to show what happens, and as it turns out, both can. Looking at this first clip, I have 3 in the mag, which would be 2 after firing, and in reserves I have 10. After shooting, the mag refills to 5 due to Veist, but reserves have dropped to 7. That's plus 3 to the mag and minus 3 from reserves. Notice on the left hand side of the screen, they both proc at the same time. In this situation, the round returned from triple tap is wasted. However, in this next clip, I was also about to fire a third round, so that would normally drop the mag to 2, and I have 10 in reserves. Upon impact, both Veist and triple tap proc together, but this time, triple tap effectively procs first. So +3 to the magazine, but only 2 from reserves, as that round generated from triple tap has actually been used. I don't know why this happens. I'm going to assume it's something within the game engine that determines if Weistinger is going to proc or not, and sometimes that's completed quicker or slower than the time it takes for triple tap to proc. Unless there's something out there I don't know about, if there is, let me know the reason for this in the comments. Next topic, emptying all rounds in reserves without reloading. Now at first this looked like it was only possible with enhanced battery and liquid coils. Remember, all testing was with a boss spec mod. The reason for that was accelerated coils with a magazine of 5, which became 7 with triple tap, would be emptied before the Weistinger time was up, meaning you would always need to reload manually, as there wouldn't be that final round or 2 left in the mag to fire and re-proc the perk. So originally that was going to be it for me. Liquid coils could even be better than accelerated for DPS, as you might get lucky with Weistinger and get more than 1 magazine's worth of rounds fired without reloading, something I didn't think was possible with accelerated. Topic covered, time to move on. Until I noticed what happened in this clip, on screen now, and only 3 times in total out of all the rounds I've fired with Weistinger active. This is an accelerated coils Reed's regret. I'm quickly approaching the end of the magazine, and typically the last round will be fired while Weistinger is still active. On this occasion though, the timer refreshed. Out of all 3 occasions that this happened, the timer shown just 1 or 0 seconds remaining. Now I fired 134 rounds at Kali whilst Weistinger was procced, not including the round that did the procking, and it only refreshed the timer 3 times. That's around 2 to 2.5% probability, and I say around that value as the sample size is even smaller than before. That's a much lower probability than the 10% found for the perk procking from nothing. If I was to determine probability using all the numbers, which would be 438 rounds fired and Weistinger procking 33 times, that's in the region of 7.5%, so I'm not really sure. Is it an overall 7.5% chance of procking or refreshing? Is it 10% without Weistinger and a second stage of roughly 2% chance of refreshing the timer with Weistinger active? Is this a bug and the timer shouldn't reset at all? Or since this only happened when the timer was at 1 or 0 seconds, is there a 10% probability when the timer is very low? And by taking into account the rounds when the timer was at say 4 or 5 seconds for example, I've skewed those numbers. I'm not sure. Seriously, if anyone from Bungie watches this, which I doubt, but you never know, would it be possible to get an answer? Just out of curiosity, as it seems to be a slightly complex perk. So with most of the workings of the perk out the way, let's look at some quick simulated DPS numbers. With the amount of chance going on with this perk, like when it procs, will a round refresh the timer, will triple tap generate a round or will it be wasted, etc. I'm only going to give a few examples for each of the 3 coil or battery perks, and in any example of Weistinger procking, it's always in the final round of a magazine, except for the final mag of course. So let's just start with accelerated coils for now, allowing me to explain what's going on, as this table may look a little confusing at first. There are 4 examples, a base with no Weistinger, and 3 more with Weistinger procking at the end of each magazine, once for one example, twice for the next, and 3 times for the last example. That last example means there are no manual reloads, as there are only 4 mags here simulated. For a corresponding round fired, the number below is the time it takes to fire that round from the moment the previous round was fired itself. The exception here is the opening round, which is just base charge time. The sum of all those numbers for an example gives the total time it takes to fire every round over the simulated period. For the base example with no Weistinger, the simulated total time to fire 28 rounds is just 0.05 seconds less than what it's taken me to do this in-game, as can be seen in my most recent video prior to this one, so the method isn't too bad if not perfect. Everything has been colour coordinated. Blue means the round had a normal charge time, green means it's Weistinger charge time, orange indicates triple tap as proc, gold indicates Weistinger as proc, and red indicates a manual reload inside a lunar well. On the far right we have total time, total damage and average DPS, while at the bottom are the numbers used and the colour key. Despite this being somewhat of an unknown, for the simplicity of the table and video, I've also assumed the 7th round from accelerated coils with Weistinger proc can re-proc it again. This is where we see the timer reset at 0 seconds. So according to these simulations, an approximate increase of around 1000 sustained DPS each time Veist Stinger activates. Of course, there are places it could proc and have less of an impact, because this is assuming it's always at the end of a magazine, but not the final magazine. Interestingly, with a 7-round mag like here for accelerated and triple, if Veist Stinger procs 1 round before triple tap is due to, you'll now have 8 rounds to fire before you need to manually reload. Normally it would just be 7. This can be seen here in the third example, triple tap activating on what is effectively the first round of a mag. It means it will activate 2 more times for a total of 3 instances, which takes 5 rounds up to 8. This is the reason the third and fourth examples have 29 rounds in total as opposed to 28. Despite that, Veist Stinger may proc again, meaning there'll be no need to manually reload anyway, as is the case with the fourth example. Now let's take a look at liquid coils, as this follows the exact same structure as accelerated. Because they have the same size magazines, it's just the charge time and damage that's different. There's not really much to talk about here, other than liquid can only really fire 6 rounds with Veist Stinger proc. There's a very small overlap with the charge time of the 7th round on Veist Stinger, but I found it made next to no difference to the charge time. The base simulation with no Veist Stinger is half a second out here compared to when I tested this in game for my previous video, but again, half a second at close to 33 seconds overall isn't something I'm particularly bothered about. As with accelerated coils, there's a rough increase of 1000 in sustained DPS each time Veist Stinger procs. Remember, that's with it proccing at the end of each magazine. As you may have expected, it's not as good as accelerated, but with just 2 instances of Veist, it's already matching Sleeper Simulant for sustained DPS, while total damage is massively higher. And finally, it's enhanced battery, completely different firing order and dynamics than the last 2, as this has 6 in the magazine, which increases to 8 with triple tap. Because typically I only test full magazines, there are only 3 simulated results here, one with no Veist, an example with just 1 activation, and an example with 2. First, a base simulation with no Veist, which was only 0.2 seconds off the time from when I actually tested this, again in my last video. Average DPS also typically increases by 1000 for each extra instance of Veist Stinger proccing. Don't focus too much on the low damage, that's because I've only tested 3 mags, like I've already explained. With enhanced battery, if triple tap procs the round after Veist Stinger has, this allows you to fire 9 rounds from a single magazine. And remember, all these numbers are with a boss spec mod, not backup. Veist Stinger really does change the dynamics of when triple tap typically procs. There isn't a great deal to say specifically about enhanced, however I will quickly conclude what my opinion is between these 3 and Veist Stinger in general. First, this method means any combination of Veist Stinger proccing can be simulated, and let's be honest, every time you use Reed's Regret for DPS, it's not always going to proc in the manner demonstrated here. These are just the examples I've chosen. In theory, the best that could happen, other than proccing in such a way that you never had to reload manually, is to also proc on the opening round of the opening magazine, as then you'll have a reduced charge time on most, if not all of the rounds in that opening magazine. I've always been an accelerated coils person, but with Veist Stinger, I'm leaning towards enhanced battery, despite the marginally lower DPS, as you have 1 round per magazine more, which is 1 more round that could cause Veist Stinger to proc. I'm not really a fan of RNG and perks or in general, but here, I don't feel like I'm losing out during those situations where RNG isn't on my side. This isn't Clown Cartridge, which in order to have, I'd need to give up triple tap. There are no other perks that help DPS in that Veist Stinger slot, so if it doesn't proc how you'd like, you're not really losing out by not having another perk that's more of a guarantee or in your control. And for that reason, despite how much potential it has, this is the only RNG perk that I personally like. I'd really love at some point in the future if Bungie could explain some of the things happening with this perk, such as the timer refreshing and it proccing at the same time as triple tap, etc. Just out of curiosity. And that is all from me. I hope you enjoyed the video and I certainly hope you found it interesting. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.